The smoke rose from the ridge, a thin, persistent gray question against the bruised autumn sky. Down in the valley, Silas Croft paused his work, leaning on the handle of his axe. He squinted, his eyes narrowed by 70 years of watching that same ridge. He saw the smoke, but he saw no cabin. No walls, no roofline, nothing but the familiar dark shapes of pine and the pale skeletons of aspen against the coming winter. He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the frosted ground. It was the boy's smoke. The fool boy, digging his own grave. 16 years old and an orphan now, Elias had been given a choice by the town council, which was really no choice at all. Take the $10 left from the sale of his parents' meager things and be on his way, or be sent to the workhouse over the mountains. Mr. Abernathy, who owned the land, the mill, and the general store, had made the offer sound like charity. "The boy's old enough to make his own way," he'd declared, his voice smooth and final. "His father was a strange man, filled his head with nonsense. Best he learns the value of real work." So Elias had taken the $10, a canvas sack with a loaf of bread, a whetstone, and his father's leather-bound journal. He'd whistled once, a low, soft sound, and the big, dark dog that had been waiting patiently by the church steps rose and padded silently to his side. They had walked out of town without looking back. That was in August. Now, in late October, the valley was preparing for the cold. Barns were full, woodpiles stood like small fortresses beside every home, and the talk was of the hard winter coming. They said the squirrels were frantic, the woolly worms wore thick black coats, and the old farmer's almanac promised a season of deep snow and bitter wind. On the ridge, Elias worked. He had walked for a day, the dog Boulder a steady presence at his heel, until he found the place his father's journal described. A south-facing slope, sheltered from the north wind by a granite spine, with a spring that trickled from the rocks 100 yards away. He had dropped his sack, taken the shovel from his pack, the one his father had forged himself, with an ash handle worn smooth by his hands, and he had begun to dig. Boulder watched, his head cocked, his intelligent brown eyes following the rhythmic rise and fall of the shovel. The first cut into the earth was the hardest, through a thick mat of roots and grass. Elias's hands, soft from a year of caring for his ailing mother, blistered within the first hour. By dusk, they were raw and bleeding. He stopped not because of the pain, but because the light was gone. He ate a piece of bread, shared a strip of dried meat with Boulder, and slept rolled in his blanket at the base of a pine, the dog a warm, solid weight against his back. The next day he dug again, and the day after that. A week passed. The hole grew, a raw, rectangular wound in the hillside. He was not just digging a hole, he was carving a space. The journal was specific. 12 feet wide, 20 feet long. The back wall would be the hill itself. The front would be 7 feet high. He used a length of twine and 4 sharpened sticks to keep his lines true. The earth was a mix of dark topsoil, then a dense layer of clay, then gravel and stone. He piled it neatly to one side, a mountain of displaced earth that grew with each passing day. It was Silas Croft who found him first. The old farmer was checking his traps and saw the raw earth from a distance. He rode his horse up the slope, stopping at the edge of the excavation. Elias didn't stop digging, the shovel a part of him. Scrape, lift, toss. Scrape, lift, toss. "What in God's name are you doing, boy?" Silas asked, his voice rough as bark. Elias paused, planting the shovel in the earth. He wiped sweat from his brow with the back of a dirty forearm. "Building a home?" Silas chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "A home? That's a hole. You're digging a pit in the ground. The first big rain will fill it and the frost will heave it, and by midwinter you'll be a block of ice. You can't live in a hole." "It's not a hole," Elias said quietly. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He just picked up the shovel again. Scrape, lift, toss. Silas watched for another minute, shaking his head. "You're your father's son, all right. Stubborn and foolish. Don't you know there's a blizzard predicted for this territory that hasn't been seen in 100 years? Wait until winter, boy. You'll see." He turned his horse and rode away, the encounter already forming into a story he would tell at Abernathy's store. The story spread. The orphan boy on the ridge, digging a hole to live in. It became a piece of local amusement. Mrs. Gable, who had been a friend to Elias's mother, wrung her hands. "The poor child," she'd say to anyone who would listen. "He's lost his mind with grief. Someone should go up there and bring him back." But no one did. Mr. Abernathy scoffed at the idea. "He made his choice. Let him lie in the bed he digs for himself, or the grave, as it were." The men in the store laughed. Elias heard none of it. His world had shrunk to the dimensions of his work. The hole became a room. The pile of earth became a wall. His hands stopped bleeding and hardened into leather, the calluses thick and yellow. He worked from dawn until dusk, fueled by the small hoard of provisions he'd bought with his $10 and the rabbits he caught in simple snares. Boulder, ever watchful, would sometimes bring him a grouse, laying it gently at his feet and looking up for a quiet word of praise. When the digging was done, the floor leveled and tamped hard, he began the second phase, the stones. The journal had pages of intricate drawings showing how to lay a dry stack wall, no mortar needed. It was about balance, friction, and finding the right stone for the right place. He spent 2 weeks at the creek bed half a mile down the slope, finding them. He looked for flat-face stones, angular stones, heavy foundation stones. He carried them back one by one on a crude sled he built from 2 saplings and a piece of canvas. The work was brutal. His back screamed. His legs ached. Each stone was a victory. He would place it on the growing pile, his hand lingering on its cool, solid surface. 231 stones. He counted them every night. He started the walls at the front of the excavation, building them up from the inside, leaving a 3-foot opening for a door. The stones fit together like a puzzle, a large flat one for the base, a smaller, thicker one on top, its weight settling it into place. He learned the language of the stone, the way a slight angle could lock a section together, the way a small chinking stone could make a larger one immovable. It was slow, meditative work. Each stone was a word in a long sentence. He was not building a wall. He was writing a declaration. "This is my home." While he worked, a visitor came. Not a skeptic, but a girl. Lena, the blacksmith's daughter. She was his age, with quiet eyes and a way of moving that was as deliberate as his own. She brought a small cloth-wrapped parcel. "My father said you were up here," she said, not looking at the hole but at his hands. "My mother sent some stew." Elias stopped his work, surprised. He hadn't spoken to anyone but Silas Croft in weeks. He took the parcel, his hands clumsy and caked with mud. "Thank you." She watched him for a moment. "They say you're digging a grave." "It's a house," he said. Her eyes moved over the half-finished stone wall, the neat stacks of timber he'd begun to cut and peel for the roof beams. She saw the order in the chaos. She saw the intention. "How will you keep the roof from falling in?" He pointed to the journal, which lay open on a flat rock, protected from the dew by a piece of oilcloth. My father knew things about arches and weight. It'll work." She nodded, as if that was a complete and satisfactory answer. She did not mock. She did not doubt. She just watched, her curiosity genuine. She stayed for an hour, saying little, while Elias went back to his work, the rhythm of his labor unbroken by her presence. When she left, she said, "I'll come back." And she did. Once a week, she would walk the path up the ridge, bringing a small offering of food, a jar of preserves, a fresh-baked loaf of bread. She never stayed long, but her quiet visits were a crack of light in his solitary world. By mid-November, the structure was taking shape. The stone walls were complete, rising 7 feet high and enclosing the front of the space. Now came the timbers. He'd spent a week felling 10 straight, thick pines from a stand a quarter-mile away. The crack and crash of their fall echoed in the silent woods. Getting them to the site was the hardest work yet. He used ropes and a simple lever system, his body and boulders straining together, dragging the massive logs over the rough ground. It took him 4 days to move 10 logs. He slept like the dead, every muscle a dull fire. He notched the beams and laid them across the span, from the top of the stone wall to recesses he'd carved into the hard-packed earth of the back slope. They were heavy, immense. He used 2 stout poles as levers to inch them into place, his breath coming in ragged gasps, sweat stinging his eyes. When the last beam was set, he stood back, his chest tight with a feeling he couldn't name. The skeleton of a roof was in place. It was real. He laid smaller poles across the main beams, then covered the entire structure with the large sheet of treated oilcloth his mother had kept for mending wagon covers. It was his most prized possession after the journal and the shovel. Over this, he began to layer the sod he had so carefully excavated. He cut it into uniform blocks and laid them like shingles, grass side up. He piled it on, 2 feet thick, then 3. The weight settled the timbers, locking everything together. He raked the loose soil over the top, scattering pine needles and fallen leaves across the surface. From 20 yards away, the structure began to disappear. It looked less like a building and more like a natural swell in the land, a small, grassy knoll that had always been there. The final piece was the most clever, a design from the most obscure chapter of his father's journal. It was a section on earth-sheltered dwellings from a book written by a long-dead philosopher who believed in living within the land, not on it. The chimney was not a chimney. It was a long, low flue, built of flat stones that ran 30 feet horizontally under the sod, gently sloping upwards and venting out of a small, rock-lined hole hidden amongst a cluster of ferns. A cold air intake pipe, buried underground, fed oxygen directly to the small stone firebox he built in the corner. The design meant the smoke would cool as it traveled, dispersing low to the ground, nearly invisible and scentless by the time it emerged. It also meant the fire would burn hotter and more efficiently, using less wood. He finished the door last, a thick, heavy thing made of 2 layers of planking with a layer of dried moss packed between for insulation. He hung it on heavy iron hinges Lena's father had given her for him, no questions asked. The day he fitted the door into its frame, the first snowflakes of the year began to fall. They were small and hesitant, melting as they touched the ground. He stood inside his home for the first time. The air was still and cool, smelling of earth and raw pine. A single beam of light fell from a small, thick-paned window he'd set high in the stone wall. He had traded his father's pocket watch for it at a tinker's cart weeks ago. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Boulder padded in, circled 3 times, and lay down with a contented sigh. Elias built a fire in the stone hearth. The flue drew perfectly. A thin wisp of smoke, barely visible, puffed from the hidden vent 30 feet away. Warmth began to fill the small space. He had done it. He spent the next 2 weeks preparing for what was coming. He hauled and stacked firewood inside, enough to last for months. He lined the walls with shelves and filled them with his meager stores. Sacks of flour and beans, smoked fish, dried berries, and the jars Lena had brought. He built a bed into the wall, a simple wooden frame with a mattress of woven pine boughs. He carved a table and a single stool. The space was no longer an excavation. It was a room. It was a home. It was a fortress. Down in the valley, the snow came and went. The cold deepened. Silas Croft, riding his fence line, would sometimes look up at the ridge. The boy's mound was now covered in a layer of white, indistinguishable from the rest of the landscape. But sometimes, if the light was just right, he could see that faint curl of smoke. He'd shake his head. "Poor fool," he'd mutter to his horse. "He'll be dead by Christmas." The last time Lena came, the air had a brittle, dangerous edge to it. The sky was the color of lead. "My father says it's coming," she said, her breath pluming in the cold. "The big one. He says the barometer has never been lower." "I'm ready," Elias said, standing in the doorway of his shelter. The warmth from inside spilled out, a palpable thing. She looked past him into the cozy, fire-lit space. She saw the stacked wood, the organized shelves, the sleeping dog. She saw not a grave, but a sanctuary. "Be safe, Elias." "I will," he said. It was a promise. 3 days later, the world went white. It did not start as snow. It started as a sound, a low moan in the pines that grew to a deafening roar. The sky, which had been a flat, oppressive gray, turned a churning, bruised black. Then the wind hit, a solid wall of force that tore branches from trees and sent loose shingles flying from the roofs in town. And then came the snow. It was not a gentle dusting. It was a horizontal torrent, thick and blinding, like a river of ice flowing through the air. They would call it the Black Winter of '88, a storm that would become legend. In the valley, panic was a cold, sharp thing. The snow piled up with impossible speed, an inch, then a foot, then 3 feet in a matter of hours. The wind drove it into drifts that buried fences and blocked doorways. The temperature plummeted, 20 degrees, 10, 0. Then it dropped further, into territory no living person in the valley had ever experienced. The ink in inkwells froze solid. The water in bedside pitchers turned to ice. Mr. Abernathy sat in his large, well-built house, listening to the timbers groan under the weight of the accumulating snow. He had more firewood than anyone, but the wind found every crack in the walls, its icy fingers reaching deep into the rooms. He was not worried. He was annoyed. This was an inconvenience. Silas Croft, in his sturdy old farmhouse, knew this was more than an inconvenience. He had seen bad winters, but nothing like this. The sound of the wind was a living thing, a predator trying to claw its way inside. He stuffed rags into the window frames and kept the fire roaring, but the cold was winning. He could feel it creeping across the floorboards. For Elias, the storm was a distant rumor. Inside the hollow, the roar of the wind was a muted hum. The immense weight of the snow on his roof, 3 feet of earth and now 4 feet of powder, was the best insulation in the world. The temperature inside held at a steady 65 degrees. The fire in his small, efficient hearth burned with a steady, hypnotic flame, fed by the constant draw of the underground flue. Boulder slept near the hearth, his paws twitching as he dreamed. Elias sat at his small table, mending a tear in his coat by the light of a tallow lamp. He felt the deep, resonant peace of a ship's captain in a safe harbor, listening to a tempest rage outside. He was warm. He was dry. He was safe. He had prepared. This was the test, and his father's strange knowledge was passing. It'll work, he thought. It was working. The storm lasted for 4 days. When it finally broke, the world was silent and unrecognizable. A thick, seamless blanket of white covered everything. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue, and the air was so cold it hurt to breathe. In the valley, the devastation was absolute. Several smaller cabins had collapsed under the weight of the snow. The roof of the livery stable had caved in, killing 3 horses. People were trapped in their homes, their doors and windows blocked by drifts 10 feet high. Woodpiles were buried. Food was running low. The cold was relentless. It was a quiet, desperate catastrophe. On the 5th day, a group of men, led by Silas Croft, managed to dig their way out. Their faces were grim. They needed to check on their neighbors, to see who had survived. They gathered in the center of town, a small, dark cluster of figures in a vast expanse of white. "We need to check on the folks up Hemlock Creek," one man said. "And the Gables," another added. Their roof looked low. Silas scanned the horizon. His eyes, as they had so many times before, went to the ridge. And he saw it. Faint, almost imperceptible against the stark white of the snow-covered hillside, was a wisp of smoke. It rose, wavered, and vanished in the crystalline air. "Look," he said, pointing. The other men looked. "It's the ridge," one said. "There's nothing up there." "It's the boy," Silas said, his voice quiet. "The orphan." Mr. Abernathy, who had joined the group, his fine wool coat looking out of place, scoffed. "That's impossible. He'd have frozen to death the first night. It's probably a tree stump smoldering from a lightning strike." "There was no lightning," Silas said flatly. "I'm going up there." It was a hard journey. They used snowshoes they had fashioned from barrel staves and leather straps. The snow was deep and soft, and the going was slow. It took them 2 hours to climb what was normally a 30-minute walk. As they got closer, they could smell the wood smoke, faint but undeniable. They reached the area where Silas had last seen the boy digging. There was nothing, just a smooth, rounded hillock of snow, a small mound that looked like any other drift. No cabin, no walls, no roof. "See?" Abernathy said, breathing heavily. "Nothing. A trick of the light." But Silas was walking the perimeter of the mound, his eyes scanning the surface. He saw a slight depression in the snow, a place where something was melted away from beneath. He walked closer. Then he saw the door. It was almost completely buried, but the top 6 inches of the heavy plank frame were visible, and near it, a small wisp of steam rose from the snow. "Here!" he called out. The other men gathered around. They stared in disbelief. Silas knelt down and began to dig with his gloved hands. The others joined in. They clawed away the packed snow, revealing the sturdy wooden door. Silas pounded on it with his fist. The sound was a dull, solid thud. For a moment there was no response. Then they heard a scraping sound from within, the sound of a heavy bar being lifted. The door swung inward. Elias stood there, blinking in the sudden bright light. He was wearing a simple wool shirt. Behind him, the room was bathed in the warm, orange glow of a fire. They could feel the heat washing over them, a shocking, blissful wave. Boulder stood beside him, his tail giving a slow, tentative wag. The men stared, speechless. They saw the neat stacks of wood, the shelves of food, the stone walls, the timbered ceiling. They saw a space that was not just surviving, but comfortable, thriving. Elias? Silas Croft's voice was a choked whisper. He took in the scene, his mind struggling to reconcile the impossible warmth and safety with the deadly cold he had just come from. How? Elias just looked at them. He saw their frost-nipped faces, their exhausted eyes. He saw the cold that clung to them like a shroud. He stepped back. "Come in," he said. They stumbled inside one by one into the warmth. They pulled off their gloves and held their hands toward the fire, their faces a mixture of awe and shame. Mr. Abernathy was the last one in. He looked around the small, ingenious space, at the dry floor, the sturdy ceiling, the evidence of foresight and labor everywhere. He looked at the quiet, 16-year-old boy who had done all this, who they had all dismissed as a fool. "We thought you were dead," Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. He looked at Elias, really looked at him, and saw not a foolish boy, but a man. "We were wrong. I was wrong. I'm sorry, son." Elias gave a short, simple nod. There was no triumph in his eyes, no "I told you so." There was only a quiet acceptance. He went to a shelf and took down several tin cups. "There's broth," he said. That day the hollow became a rescue station. Elias gave them his spare snowshoes, and the men went back down to the valley, returning with the weakest and the coldest. They brought Mrs. Gable, whose house was half collapsed and whose firewood was gone. They brought her 2 small children, their faces pale and scared. Elias wrapped the children in his spare blanket and sat them by the fire. He gave them warm broth and a piece of bread with honey on it. By nightfall, there were 10 people sheltered in the hollow. It was crowded, but it was warm and it was safe. Mr. Abernathy, a man used to giving orders, sat on a log in the corner, silent and humbled, sipping broth from a tin cup beside the farmer he employed. He watched Elias move through the small space, tending the fire, checking on the children, speaking in his quiet, reassuring way. He had survived not through wealth or power, but through knowledge, patience, and the work of his own 2 hands. The black winter lasted for 2 more weeks, a period of unrelenting cold. The hollow on the ridge became a beacon. Elias's knowledge, once dismissed as foolishness, was now their salvation. He showed them how his flue system worked, how the sod roof held in the heat. He shared his food, his fire, and his home without a word of reproach. He tended to their frostbite, his hands gentle and sure as he applied the salve his mother had taught him to make. In the shared warmth of that small, earthen room, the community was reforged. The old hierarchies of wealth and age dissolved, replaced by the simple, brutal realities of survival. They were not saved by the mayor or the merchant. They were saved by the orphan boy they had cast out. When the great thaw finally came, they emerged from the hollow into a changed world. As they rebuilt the valley, they did so with a new humility and a new wisdom. The following autumn, Silas Croft and 2 other farmers came to Elias. They did not come to offer advice, they came to ask for it. "Will you teach us?" Silas asked. Elias nodded. He took out his father's journal and opened it on the table he had built. Over the next years, the landscape of the valley changed. Several more hollows were dug into the hillsides, built not by lone orphans but by communities working together. They became winter houses, storm shelters, places of refuge. The knowledge from the old journal, once the secret of a strange stonemason and his quiet son, became the common wisdom of the valley. They were never caught unprepared again. Elias did not leave the ridge. Lena came to him, not for a visit, but to stay. They were married in the spring, standing in front of the stone-faced entrance to the hollow. They enlarged the space, digging another room and then another as their family grew. Elias taught his children how to read the journal, but also how to read the land, the sky, and the seasons. His hands were never soft again. They were the hands of a man who built, who provided, and who protected. Time passed, as it does, in a rhythm of seasons. The children grew up and built hollows of their own. The valley prospered, its people hardy and self-reliant, their character forged in the memory of the black winter. One cool autumn evening many years later, Boulder, now old and gray-muzzled, did not get up for his dinner. He lay by the hearth, his breathing shallow. Elias sat on the floor beside him, his hand resting on the dog's flank. He stayed there all night. In the morning, Boulder was gone. Elias carried the still, heavy body outside and buried him on the small hillock above the hollow's entrance, a spot that caught the morning sun. He placed a single, smooth river stone on the grave. There was no ceremony, just a long, quiet moment of farewell to the first believer. Decades flowed by. Lena passed, and Elias lived on, a quiet patriarch, his hair as white as the winter snows. The story of the boy who dug his home into the hill became a local legend, told to children on stormy nights. Elias rarely spoke of it. He didn't have to. His life was the story. He died in his sleep one night, in the bed he had built into the earthen wall so long ago. He was 93 years old. The entire valley and the generations they had spawned came to the ridge to say goodbye. They buried him beside Lena, near the simple stone that marked Boulder's grave. They erected a larger stone for him, cut from the same granite spine that sheltered the hollow from the north wind. The inscription was carved by Silas Croft's grandson, a stonemason himself. It did not list his accomplishments or his titles. It said only, "Elias, he showed us the way home." Long after the last person who remembered the black winter was gone, the hollow remained. It became part of the land itself, the sod roof a lush green in the summer, a mound of pure white in the winter. The stone entrance, draped with moss and wild roses, looked as ancient and as natural as the rocks around it. The heavy wooden door still swung open on its sturdy iron hinges, leading into the cool, quiet dark. It stood not as a monument to one man's stubbornness, but as a testament to a simple, profound truth, that the greatest strength is often quiet, the deepest wisdom is often hidden, and that a true home is not something built upon the land, but within it. It was a shelter. It was a legacy. It was a promise kept.